an information system specialist, a technical services librarian, a special projects manager, an e-resource management librarian, and now cataloging and metadata. Is that enough titles for everybody? It's definitely been enough titles for me. None of those titles actually involve the word migration in them. But because I think with cataloging going more into the sphere of metadata and the fact that I have been lucky to have good support in helping me learn coding languages on the fly, pretty much every one of those jobs has ended up with me taking lead on a large migration project. So why is this relevant to a conference that's mainly focused on acquisitions? I had a lot of questions about this myself. I applied on a whim and got accepted because 2021 is full of lots of surprises. I think one of the reasons this is relevant is because this is what we're all doing. And in acquisitions, you are buying the tools and the vendor resources and the journals and the newspapers, and you want to make sure that if there is current technology for discovery that is being used, or you're adopting a new technology for discovery that will be used, that anything you buy is accessible. So my slightly controversial professional motto has always been, what is the point of having content if no one can find it? There was an interesting example from the last session where somebody was talking about going from one version of Easy Proxy to another and losing the IP ranges for access in the process. This is not an uncommon tale. I actually had almost the exact same thing happen to me one time, where you're running around trying to make sure you know who all your vendor reps are, because they change all the time, and who the appropriate contacts are, and what the data is that you need, and how to get to the right person. And in all of that, you are paying for content that nobody can access. A lot of this, in my opinion, is all about making sure you are prepared with good data maps. I know that is not something acquisitions department usually has on the forefront of their mind. You're thinking about budgets and how to make sure everything gets paid for and who your vendor reps are. But it is important to make sure that the people who are mapping data know what needs to be accessible and how you're getting from one place to another. So I have worked on projects where I was going from just Microsoft file share to a digital asset management system in something called Widen. I've worked on projects where we went from serial solutions to OCLC World Share. One of my favorite projects was one where I had a bunch of different small libraries that were going over to Cersei Dynix Symphony. And that was all these little libraries who all had different formats of keeping metadata. So you started by having to track and map what was being done in an Excel, in an Access database, in a citation manager, Unimark. We had a German office that was using a standard called MAB, which is apparently the German version of Mark 21. And you have to map all that together and then get that into Symfony. And people still need to be able to discover, once you get to your endpoint, all the things they want, all the things they've paid for, and be able to access them. I've also gone on the archive side from something called Archon to something called Archive Space. If anybody here has dealt with finding aids, you know they have their own unique set of questions, issues, problems. And then more and more lately, I've been working with MSLIS. I just worked at a library that did a big migration from Cersei Dynix over to MSLIS. I now work as part of the California State University Consortium, and they are all on MSLIS. Now, Primo VE is the discovery system, and we've got ALMA as the ILS. To do all these mappings, the number one thing that I used was Excel. Excel is everybody's best friend. But on the fly, I've had to learn, HTML, Python, XML in a variety of different schemas. And if this were a technical conference, we'd get into a lot of why XML is both very, very widely used and has 1,000 schemas and standards, many of which are unique to your ILS vendor. They will come up with their own schemas in a lot of cases, and you just got to figure out how to map them, in which is why I had to learn XPath, XSLT. My last job, I was coding in command line for Linux, Windows, and Amazon, and using REST APIs, none of which I had training on until I took these jobs. So, I think a through line in most conversations these days is we all need to communicate more. If I had not been able to communicate across from, acquisitions, e-resources, cataloging, with IT departments, sometimes technical departments that were supporting me being in the library, sometimes not, the majority of the times not, being able to communicate across these different stakeholders is one of the biggest challenges, I think, and that is probably a through line in any conversation you're having, whether it's getting to students or getting to faculty or just talking to your colleagues on the other side of the library. Being able to code switch, I think, is a big part of it. Being able to sit and listen and follow and ask questions is the only way I was able to figure out all of these things. And then Google, because we all use Google a lot. So, and involved in this communication, there's a lot of drawings. This was one of my favorites. This was about 10 years ago. I worked on a project where we were instituting WorldCat Local, and it was totally new, and discovery systems were totally new. And so I was trying to explain to everybody how the discovery system worked. And this was my beautiful drawing of a lake, which was WorldCat Local, and then all of the data that went into it. So diagrams are helpful when figuring things out, in addition to your pretty pictures. I had my little diagram triangle. Here's your search results. You're placing calls. This is how the data is formatted. Lots and lots of multi-page instructional documentation. And oftentimes the documentation would be phrased slightly differently for different people based on who the stakeholders were and what they were doing. And then there was more diagrams in those documents. But really, it's all about the map. You will never be able to get things like Unimark catalog records from the National Library of Israel. This was one of my favorites because the records are in a non-Roman character set and in something called Unimark, which is heavily used in Europe. And it came in XML, and I use Mark XML, but for Mark 21. So without appropriate data map, I would not have been able to get this into our Mark 21 catalog. You get things like holdings reports from your ILS, and it's in some unique to the vendor XML format, and you got to get it into Excel. So, people in acquisitions can see what the report says. And then one of my favorites was I had to get data from using an Ex Libris API, using Windows command line. This was great, you call these curl commands. And then you transform them with XSLT, which was using some XSD schema, which I still don't know what that is, but in talking to IT people and some friends I have who are data scientists and talking to the stakeholders at the end who actually needed the data, you eventually get to where you need to be. In all of these conversations, I will continually come back to the fact that if you don't have a good data map, if you don't know what your point A is and your point B, everybody will get lost somewhere in the middle. And I have seen that happen more times than I would like to admit, because I've been a participant in not having good maps, as well as an active member in trying to get those good maps. And the key in all of this, which I will come back to over and over again, is communication. I think more than anything else, I have acted as a translator in these migration projects. I have a specific specialty, and that's cataloging was my original training, you know, your basic Mark 21. And I think it's helpful to explain and understand where Mark 21 came from when you're working with people who aren't familiar with it, you know, because you go from what the basis of almost any ILS is to all of these different encoding schemas that are coming in to make that discovery system work. You've got data coming in from your vendor and data being delivered from the discovery system, and data coming in from maybe your ScholarWorks portal with bpress, or your digital asset management system. So all of these things need to talk to each other when you get to the end, because that is what the student expectation is, right? They expect to be able to go to one place. In the case of the California state schools, we call our search box One Search. And the expectation, therefore, is that you only have one place to search for things, and they all need to be discoverable there. There is a big burden on the technology managers to make that happen. And especially when you're doing a migration project, you want to make sure that you're keeping what you had before, you're not losing anything, which involves a lot of making sure you know what you have. But more than anything else, if you're not talking to as many people involved in the process as you possibly can, something will get missed in this map. We live in a very data-driven world, and for better or worse, that means we have to learn to make the data understand each other, understand how to understand itself, I think is the word. So I have a couple tips if anybody's working on a migration project. The first is understand a basic if-then statement. If you are doing any kind of encoding or any kind of mapping, trying to get one encoding standard to understand another, all computer coding is based on the if-then statement. If I have data in column A, I want it to correspond to data in column B using these criteria. And if you know what your if-then statement is, and you can use Google, almost anything you can think of will come up on this site called Stack Overflow, which is where I look up almost all of my code, because I don't actually have training in Python or command line. And I only need to get what I need to get to make my project happen. But you have to understand the basics of what is possible. The next is you will be learning new languages anytime you do a migration. And it seems like everything would be in English, but I think we all know that every industry has jargon and every vendor has jargon. One of my favorite examples is when I did, when I went from a Circe Dynix ILS to a Ex Libris ILS, all of a sudden everybody had to understand that check-in and check-out was no longer under a section called circulation. It's now under a section called fulfillment. And one of the first things I had to explain to everybody was that it's the same function. They're just calling it something different. So these language shifts can be in very basic places, but they come up all over. And it's really important that everybody be patient with themselves and patient with each other when trying to figure these things out. The third is, if you're dealing with an integration problem or a mapping issue, never accept the first no you get, especially if you're asking your vendors if they can make an integration work. A lot of times we are trying things that are new to the vendor. The vendor wants to sell the product. They want to get you working on the product, but they don't know what all of your data needs are, what all of your discovery needs are. They don't know what your other products are. So a lot of times you're going to ask them, oh, I'd like to be able to get all of the full text indexing from our digital scholarship portal discoverable in Primo. And they're going to be like, I don't know what that is. I don't think we can do that. And then you have to sit down and say, no, I'm not going to take no for an answer. Let me explain to you exactly how this works. Let me explain to you the fact that I know it's possible. And then let's sit down and figure it out together. You know, we're going to be really nice and polite and say it in a very positive way. But I've gotten a lot of no's to the first time questions that when I explain more and you push through, it really is possible to make things integrate, especially with the tools that are available with APIs at this point. So number 4 is push for integration of every product you buy into the discovery system. Another through topic, I think, in this conference is going to be that an increased number of users expect information to be readily available. And if it's not readily available, they'll think it doesn't exist. And back to my motto, what is the point of having content if nobody can find it? A lot of things get overlooked when you migrate from one technology system to another, but it all has to come back down to the content. If you've purchased something or you've made something, the metadata has to be good enough, the maps have to be good enough that it is discoverable. Otherwise, you are creating what we refer to in archives as hidden collections. It's, even if it's not a piece of paper in a back room, it's a piece of data on a server, it doesn't mean people can find it. So push for those integrations for every single product as much as possible. I think even yesterday when I was going around talking to different vendors, it was one of the things I was mentioning, you know, which vendors have full text search access? Are you contributing your metadata to their CDIs and central indexes? If you're not, you might lose some customers. And then number 5 is prepare yourself for the fact that you will have to explain and re-explain and re-explain your work to every stakeholder many, many times. Every time you do a migration, everybody involved has to learn these new languages and they have to learn these new processes. And sometimes you have to build the workflow, you know, just going from acquisitions to circulation from scratch because your new database functions a slightly different way. And especially when you get to systems and workflow processes that people have been using for a long time, it takes a while. And I think especially on the system side, we don't leave time for that at the end of a project. So while the main product of creating a successful migration is the data maps and the decisions and, you know, working with the vendor through implementation, the main actual work of every one of these projects for me has been explaining decisions, explaining changes, making sure everybody is trained, and trying to figure out everybody who would be affected, trying to figure out all the systems, the data, the products that are affected by moving your discovery system, or your digital asset management system, or getting upgrades to your digital commons platform. every single time. It's something new for someone to learn. If you manage the migration, you have to manage making sure people know how to use the new tools. The maps are really helpful there too, and the diagrams. And that's my chalk. I think that was a good amount of babbling for me. So I'm gonna come and check in on, there's a lot of stuff in the chat. I'm open to questions if anybody wants to go to the mic, but if we could turn on Mara, maybe she can let us know if there's any good questions in the chat.
Hi, Jill. We don't have any questions in the Pathable chat right now. We had a few audio issues. That's what most of the discussion was about.
Okay.
But great talk, and I'll keep an eye here on the chat.
Does anybody have any questions here? Yeah.
That sounds on. Yeah, thank you. That was a great talk.
Thank you.
I'm just wondering how you seem to not be intimidated by learning new technology, but I feel like a lot of people are when facing these, kind of things. And you gave some tips, but like, what advice do you have for people who are just like, don't even know where to start? How do you become willing to be like, okay, I can learn this new language or this new technology to take this on?
So that's a great question. And a lot of what I dealt with early on in my career. So this little diagram happened just because I had time. Everybody was sort of struggling at that institution with what a discovery system is. And because my part of the migration at the time, I was just doing electronic resources, which was going from basically an A to Z list to the knowledge, what WorldCat called the knowledge base. So basically just going through and saying, okay, these are all the databases I had. So it was a very quick one-to-one. And then everybody started asking me questions like, this is very new, I don't know how this works. And so just because my part went fast, I ended up sitting down with the integration manager from WorldCat and having them explain to me. And then I explained to the users. I think a lot of this was less daunting to me than to others because I had some good, in my library school program, we had some good teacher training. So the concept of learning something to then teach it to others was something I was familiar with. The technology, I think, was less daunting to me just because I was already sort of living in Mark 21 as a cataloger. Once you know the basics of how encoding and, even if you just know basic HTML, like you've got enough to start with. Then when you get to the other side of the question, which is where do you start if you have to manage this? The other side is how do you bring people along with you? I have experienced a lot of sitting with people who are very uncomfortable with learning new technology and just being patient with them and coaxing them along. The best advice I have if you're working with somebody like that is bring it back to what they know as much as possible. So making those translations, again, the fulfillment circulation rewording is a great example because I had to, sit with the check-in, check-out staff and be like, okay, I know this looks very different, but it's actually basically the same thing. And here are the ways it's very similar. So if you have people who are very unsure with new technology, my advice is bring up the similarities as much as possible and try to start with what's the same so they have a foundation and then work from there. Any other questions? Anything on the chat?
Yes, Jill, we have a question in the chat from Victoria. Is there a system that you would recommend for creating your data maps?
I generally just use Excel. I find that that's easiest mostly because I can share it around and people understand it. When you get to the technical side, it tends to be an XML because the schemas in XML are the most widely used. So when you're getting ready to go, that's generally where the maps end up. But I like to start in Excel and then make sure everybody can have the opportunity to see it and look at it and see where the similarities are. I think most people understand that sort of table format. So especially when you're sharing with stakeholders and you want to make sure they know that circulation is now called fulfillment, and in Mark 21 title is 245, but it's 001 in Unimark. Starting in Excel is always the best place. Anything else?
We've got 2 comments. Marina says, I admire your patience and the work which you did through the career migration. Thanks a lot for the presentation. I am on my way just to start the migration and I found your speech very useful.
Thank you.
Then she asks the question, did you use MarcEdit during the migration?
Yes, MarcEdit is a very good friend of mine. One of my favorite things to do in MarcEdit is actually export to and from Excel. Again, because a lot of times the stakeholders you're dealing with are not coders or catalogers, so they don't know Mark either. I've done several projects where MarcEdit was really helpful because I ended up having to take everything in the Mark catalog, everything from the catalog that was exported in Mark 21 format, and then putting it all in Excel, and then relabeling everything the way it would look in the discovery system so that I could then give that to administration and show them what data was being migrated. So yes, that's a very handy aspect. MarcEdit is also one of the easiest places to do bulk changes. I've worked on a lot of projects where we actually had to change the local fields. And in MarcEdit, it's really easy to say like, okay, in the last system, we were using the 599 for local note. Now we have to use the 590. In MarcEdit, you can export your whole catalog and just change that. When you work at a small library, you can probably do that in one switch go. If you work at a library with 1 million catalog records, you probably have to do it in batches. But yeah, super useful tool. I'm very grateful to the people who made that. Anything else?
In the chat, we're just seeing accolades for your talk.
Thanks. Yeah, it's been an interesting experience over the years. And I'm very grateful for all of the people who had patience with me while I was learning these things on the fly. The 21st century is fun. All right. In that case, I think we can call it a day. Thank you everybody for coming and listening to me, and reach out with any questions. I will be checking the conference comments all week. Thank you.